I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be speaking with Michael Curran, author of French and Indian Wars, 1609 to 1759. Conflicts that shaped a continent. Michael will talk about the French, British, colonial, and Native American combatants in these wars, and will discuss how each of their goals and strategies ultimately determine the outcome in this turbulent period in the history of the North American continent. Michael will also speak about his recently published novel, Métis, The Life and Times of Charles de Langlade. De Langlade, who was of mixed Native American and French ancestry, was a fur trader and a successful leader of both European soldiers and tribal warriors in North America during the mid to late 18th century. I'd now like to welcome Michael Curran to our show. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here.
Terrific. So you have two books out that we're going to talk about, and they are relating to the French and Indian Wars. And before we do that, I want to ask you a little bit about your background. What career did you get into, your education, and things like that before you migrated into the field of history?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the Bronx. My parents set us free, like most children back in the 60s, to run in the playground and play stickball and things like that. But on Saturdays, I spent a significant amount of time in the public library, as did my brother. He probably was the first one to take me there. And I would sit for hours, grab 4, 5, 6 books off the shelf, read as much as I could, and then take home the maximum. I think you were allowed to take home 4 books. So every Saturday I'd come home with 4 books, read those during the week, go back the following Saturday. So I did this for several years, sort of pre-teen, early teens. But, before, you got into sports and girls and all those other things, but I spent a lot of time reading. And I gravitated towards history and biographies. I'm probably more enamored of what's now referred to as the great man theory of history, where you see this biography of Napoleon or of Washington or some Churchill, some famous general, Ulysses S. Grant, for instance, and you think, oh my, these people all did everything and they were responsible for everything. Do a little more homework and you realize, no, that's not really the way to think about it. But as a young, impressionable man, I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So I saw the two, history and biographies, as very intertwined. And loved both categories. Went off to high school, where I went to Regis High School in Manhattan, had a wonderful education there, got a scholarship through my father's labor union to Cornell, went to the Industrial and Labor Relations School, because my dad said, you got to do something, you can get a job. And in particular, get a job with a pension. So I graduated, went to work for a paper company, which was a terrible place to work, unfortunately. I learned a lot in the year and a half I was there, but not a great business, not a very inspiring place. But they had a pension. So, my dad was thrilled with that part. I didn't stay long enough to earn it, but it ticked a couple of boxes for him. So I worked there for a bit in corporate and in a paper mill. I worked in a paper mill in Houston. I was always interested in how things were made, so I did enjoy that part of it, but decided I needed to come back to New York and started interviewing for jobs, and found a little agency that was doing recruiting work for Morgan Stanley, and went for a series of interviews, got the job, and that started a 35-year career in financial services, mostly on the consulting side. I was at Morgan Stanley for 2.5 years, then I went into management consulting. And that's, there's obviously lots of ins and outs in anybody's career, but that's it in a nutshell.
Well, good, solid career, put food on the table. Hey, did you get the pension?
I will tell you that the only pension check I get is $107 a month. There was one company that I worked for they bought a company I owned, and I was enrolled in a pension plan for 10 months. And so every month I get $107. It's very exciting.
Don't spend it
Or,
all in one place, though,
yeah,
Michael. Okay.
yeah. You can only get lunch for your $107 anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you reminded me when you said about your dad and the pension, because my dad worked for New Jersey Bell Telephone Company,
Mhm. Yeah.
and he always talked about the pension that he was going to get, and he did get a pension. He didn't, sadly, he didn't live to be too old, so he didn't get to collect it for very long. But then my mom did, of course. So,
Sure.
but he was a Depression era, and that was very important, that security. So he knew it was important to be taken care of and the family to be taken care of. So I see where your dad was telling you what my dad was telling me, right?
Absolutely. My dad grew up in Ireland, so the depression in Europe was, in many ways worse than it was in America. The difference is he grew up on a farm, so they always had food,
Yeah.
but there was never any money.
No.
So he lived through the 20s and the 30s into the early 40s before he actually left Ireland and went to join the RAF.
That's another story we're going to have to talk about because
Yeah.
my mother and both my grandparents were in the RAF. So
There you go.
we'll talk about that another time.
There you go.
But you talked about being in the library as a kid. Now, when I walk into a library today, there's something about the smell of a library that makes me feel good. I don't know what it is. It's just the thoughts of all those books, and it's quiet, and people are looking through things, and you could just look through the history. I used to go to the history department all the time and pull out books about many of the people you spoke about, and the Civil War and all those things. But there was always that invigorating feeling of being in a library. So you went through this career, didn't have anything specifically to do with the history that you loved, nothing specific to do with that. But what happened after you finished your 35-year career at that company and you were ready to retire? What was going through your head, and how did it eventually lead you back to history?
Well, I'd be remiss in not sharing your sense of enjoyment of walking into a library. I have a terrible sense of smell, so it was never the smell for me. It was always the visuals, the shelves, the books, particularly old libraries, which I got to visit a number of in England, where you're looking at something that is 500 years old or more. It's enchanting to me. You might have a thing about mold, James, you need to worry about with the paper, so it can go bad. Um, I did, by the way, have in the archives in the British Library, I had a book fall apart in my hands, which was momentarily embarrassing. And I thought, oh boy, how much is it going to cost me to try and get this 500-year-old document bound? And they said, oh, don't worry, it happens all the time. So
Oh boy.
I was quite surprised at that. How'd I get there? In my career, I spent a lot of time the nice thing about financial services is you're in big cities. When I was in the industrial world, you're in the middle of nowhere half the time. But in financial services, it's New York and London and Paris and Tokyo and Zurich and places like that. So I spent a lot of time in London, and I like to read everything I can get my hands on. So finished a book I was reading and took out the High Life magazine or whatever it's called, the British Airways. I was on British Airways, whatever their magazine's called. And it was an ad for this master's in military history at the University of Buckingham. And this was probably between 5 and 10 years before I retired. I said, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe someday. And then on my last year before I retired, and I knew I announced I was retiring, again, back on a British Air flight, took out the magazine, and sure enough, there was an ad. Same ad, by the way, it had not been updated. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And I'm retiring on July 1st, and, they probably have a fall semester, and this was in the spring sometime. I said, let me look into this. So I wrote away and email, and they sent me back an application, and we went back and forth. And I said, I'm coming from the United States. He said, oh, no problem. But the work's in London. I said, all right, what can I do? 6 months in London and 6 months remote. It was theoretically a 1-year degree. And he said, sure. So I signed up, and off I went, and then spent the better part of 6 months in lots of different libraries.
So you come home and you broke this news to your family, and how did that go?
Maybe I should be upset that it went surprisingly well. Um,
See ya.
they're like, oh, 6 months without him. Um, what a joy. No, I had always wanted to live in London, and I had an opportunity at one point in my career, and just where the kids were in school and the situation at home, we just said we can't. And we had a dog, and moving a dog internationally is a difficult process. It's doable, but it's very difficult, and changing schools for the kids, and so we never were able to do it. So this was my opportunity to spend some time in London, and beyond the work, just wander the city. It's one of the world's great walking cities.
Yeah, so tell us how you got into studying the French and Indian Wars. What is it that led you to that topic? And then talk about what you call in one of your books, the French and Indian Wars, and you give the date 1609 to 1759. Tell us what brought you to that topic, and then tell us about that period in time and what was the fascination about it for you?
Sure, sure. Well, I'll start off with how I got to the topic. I showed up at the University of Buckingham first meeting. Master's programs are different than undergrads anyway. This is a research degree, which they hadn't quite explained to me in the brief material that was available. So we had a couple of sessions where they said, all right, well, you got to go pick a topic, and then here's where you might find some material. And the third session was like, okay, you have to write this thing, and off you go. And at the end of three evenings of this, I was utterly confused, and had a follow-up meeting with my thesis advisor, who was the professor teaching the whole group. And I said, well, okay, what do I do? He says, well, you have to find something that adds to the canon. In the UK, you can't do a master's or PhD thesis on anything that's already been covered. I said, all right, well, that seems difficult in some places. I was really interested in writing about either the American Revolution or World War II. And as you can imagine, both of those areas have been covered in such incredible breadth and depth that you are really limited to incredibly narrow topics, or on occasion, people find something totally new, in particular when archives open up. Like, for instance, when Glasnost happened, Russian archives opened up, and there was just a raft of new books. And then they closed down again, of course. You can't get into the archives in Russia right now. But barring that, you're really limited in trying to find something that hadn't been covered. So I knew World War II was a non-starter. I looked at the American Revolution and literally Googled top 10 books about the American Revolution just to see what would pop up. And what popped up was 1,000 books. And I said, well, yeah, I'm not even sure I want to continue trying to find something that hasn't been covered. That could take me months just to find a topic.
Oh, yeah, it's been picked over.
Picked over. So I was thinking about, well, what else is there? And that's what brought me to the French and Indian War. It was not an original interest or specific interest of mine. I think, like a lot of people, I'd seen Drums Along the Mohawk, which was the original movie that was then done later with Daniel Day-Lewis as Last of the Mohicans.
Great movie.
Great. Both of them are very good movies. The second one, of course, because of the technology and the cinematography, et cetera, was really beautiful. Wonderful story, well told, a lot of action. So I thought, well, that's good. Let me Google French and Indian War top 10 books. And I could not find 10, in a sense. The list came up with Last of the Mohicans in it. I said, well, that's fiction. They can't even find 10. Now that's Google, and it's in essence even then a version of AI. So I said, well, if there's not 10 history books that pop up on the list of top 10 books about the French and Indian War, there may be an opportunity. And that's what brought me to it. So I spent 2 or 3 months trying to work through various material, books, archives, et cetera, to try and find something that was going to be of interest. And I found a couple of possible topics, and you have to write in their program at the end of the 6 months, you have to submit a dissertation for your thesis. It has to be approved for you to continue. And I submitted it, and the reader, which is part of the academic staff, sent it back and said, "Yeah, I guess it passes, but yeah, I don't really like it." And I thought, well, that's great. I've just spent 6 months, and I had three arguments that I was trying to make. One of which was related to the military, the Navy specifically, and he hated that. And I thought, well, that's not going to be good. One related to William Pitt, who was the first minister. They had no prime minister yet, and the third was related to the role of Native Americans. And that's the only one that struck a chord. Because being English, they didn't know much about it. They knew less than Americans know about it. And he said, well, that's most interesting. So I decided to narrow the topic of my thesis down to the role of Native Americans. And that's what brought me there. So accidental in a sense to end up on French and Indian War, and then serendipitous in the sense that he just didn't like the other 2 points I was trying to make. And rather than, beat my head against the wall and have not liked the final product, I decided to go with the role of Native Americans.
Well, that's a really interesting approach. And I was really glad to see that as well, because you often think of the French and the British being the primary combatants, and the Native Americans were sort of in a support role on both sides. You don't often hear of the viewpoint of the Native Americans and their contribution. But first of all, I want to back up. Studying history in the past, you hear the term French and Indian War. And when I think of French and Indian War, I think of usually 1756 to 1763 pops into my head. Then you hear about the dates 1754 to 1763, because there were really components of the war taking place before the official start of the war. And then your book says French and Indian Wars, 1609 to 1759. So then there's an even larger time span. So how do they all relate? And when you say French and Indian War, what is that period of time and how did it start? And can you, in a nutshell, tell us about it?
Sure. Do we have time for me to read the 250 pages of the book to you?
Yeah, I can hear the people turning off their cell phones right now. No.
I will try and do justice to this on a quick basis. The European dates for the war are 1756 to 1763. They're based on the actual official declaration of war and then the official close of the war with a treaty. Hence, in Europe, it's actually called the 7 Years' War. That's the time period. In the United States, wars were called different things. So there were a series of colonial skirmishes / wars that were related to larger European wars, and the Americans would give their own name to it, and the Europeans had a different name. So that's part of the confusion as well. So French and Indian War and 7 Years' War are not exactly the same. The French and Indian War is part of the 7 Years' War, because the 7 Years' War takes what started in America with George Washington out in Western Pennsylvania, and I'll cover that in a second, and expands globally. So they fight all over Europe. They fight in India. They fight off the coast of Africa. They fight in the Caribbean. They fight in Canada and in North America, New England and New York State primarily. So there are overlaps between the two. Why do I say 1609 to 1759? Because when I looked at it, again, thinking about the role of Native Americans and trying not to be Eurocentric, you realize that there were wars involving Native Americans and Europeans from their arrival. But interestingly, in the case of the French in Canada and the English in New England, not the English in Virginia, that'll be different. In both those first two cases, the wars were not between the French or English with the local tribes. It was them allying with local tribes against other tribes. So from the very beginning of European colonial presence in North America, Native Americans were manipulating them to aid in their ongoing struggles with neighbors. And for the most part, the Europeans understood that that was going on at some level, but they weren't really thinking about the political machinations. They weren't thinking about Native Americans really having a political organization. They didn't understand their tribal structure. There were no constitutions, no written laws. So they had nothing to look at as they would in a European context. So they assumed that this was somewhere between happenstance and a tactical design, never viewed anything as strategic on the part of Native Americans, which was a mistake because the Native Americans, in many cases, and it depended on the tribe, the Iroquois in particular in central New York were brilliant negotiators and brilliant politicians, and they were able to maneuver the Europeans to support their aims for a long period of time. So 1609 is the first French and Indian War. Samuel Champlain shows up in Quebec and is greeted by the Huron and Algonquian tribes that are in the vicinity, and they say, "Welcome." He says, "Great, thank you." They help them get the initial colony off the ground, primarily with food and some support in terms of trading. And then they say, "Oh, since we've been helping you, would you mind helping us?" And Champlain says, "Aha," so he gets it. He writes a beautiful memoir, which is available. And he says, "Okay, well, what do you need?" And they said, "Well, we have this problem with the local tribe we're not getting along with. Would you mind coming along? And could you bring those interesting weapons you have with you?" Which were arquebuses. They were not muskets yet. And so the primary thing for anybody who understands that kind of weaponry, and you've seen it in movies, it looks like a rifle, but you have to have a forked stick that you put it on to hold it because it's too heavy. The gun barrel will drop, so you couldn't hit anything. So it's a very cumbersome weapon, and the firing rate is once every 2 or 3 minutes. So it's not relative to a bow and arrow. It's a terrible weapon. Other than Native Americans have never seen this before, and it makes an immense amount of noise and smoke, and no one sees, the balls coming out of the rocket end of the rifle. And then when it hits something and they fall down dead, it's a pretty powerful situation. It's like a magic stick in the early days of it. So Champlain says, "Yes, off we go." 80 of them show up somewhere around where Fort Ticonderoga is. There's 200 Iroquois waiting for them. It looks like it's going to go very badly until Champlain steps forward, sets up his arquebus, fires, and kills 3 Iroquois chiefs because he's loaded multiple balls into it, and it shoots, and they're standing there in the center with their fancy headdress and paint and everything, and he shoots and he kills 3 of them. And the Iroquois are routed because they've never seen this, they didn't understand it, plus their leaders have been killed, and it's a great victory. And that's the beginning of French and Indian Wars, particularly between the French and the Iroquois, who fight from 1609 to 1701. So they have almost 100 years of virtually uninterrupted conflict. And hence, really, when you get to the 1750s, you're talking about what ends up being 150 years, in particular, of the French and Native Americans militarily going at it. The English come in later, but the French have been at it for 150 years.
Wow. So it's so important to pick up that piece of history because it just doesn't start in the mid 18th century. There's so much conflict before that and so much involvement. Let's talk about then the 1750s. When we get there, what's the situation as far as the land areas that are being colonized by the French and the British at that time? And then how did that turn into a clash that then involved the 2 European powers and different Native American tribes?
Sure. Well, it's true in really all history that things are always more complex. There's always a backstory. It's like any relationship. In the case of the French and Indian War that is so named that starts in the mid 1750s, it's really because the English colonies are trying to expand. There's a major difference between the French colonies, the Spanish colonies in Central and South America, and the English colonies. And that difference is what most Americans think of is a colony, something where you send lots of people to colonize it, to take over the land, to, at the time, of course, farm, fish, maybe cut down trees for timber, which the British did a lot of for the Navy. But you're going to occupy this land. That's what a colony is. Well, the French view of a colony was it's a great trading opportunity. So the French sent very, very few people to Canada, New France, as they called it. And at the time of the 1750, before the war starts, interestingly, both the English and the French do a census. Colonies were very different depending on where the country was that was doing the colonizing. So the English sent a lot of settlers. Primary reason, as most people will remember, is in the beginning for religious freedom. So the Puritans and the Pilgrims who come to New England are trying to get out from under the Anglican Church. But there are multiple ways of English and German who come under the English colonies who are coming for religious freedom reasons, and then for economic reasons, and then for political reasons. So it's a whole series of different reasons, but initially religious freedom. The French don't have that. French mindset is colonies are for trade. So at the census that was done in early 1750s, the French colonies going all the way from Canada all the way down the Mississippi, including Louisiana, so that was all New France, had 55,000 people. About a year difference, the English census shows that the English colonies have over 1 million people. So it's not a fair fight. It is, and has not been for a long period of time. So the only way for the French to survive is to work with Native Americans who largely support the French because the French don't want their land. So the French will say, we own all of this territory, but they don't tell the Native American tribes that. They just tell that to the Europeans. This is our territory, stay out. They leave 95% plus of that land to the local owners of that land, who are the various Native American tribes. The English want to own all the land and keep pushing Native American tribes out of their territory, going back to the early 1600s. It really starts to come to a head because of two things. One, the English charters that were given in different stages by different kings end up with overlapping geography. So the charter for Connecticut, as an example, people don't realize Connecticut's original charter has got two parallels and runs all the way to the next ocean, which happens to be the Pacific, of course. So in theory, a huge swath of what would then be the Midwest and even the West Coast of the United States are theoretically part of Connecticut's charter. New York's charter doesn't work the same way, so it goes up north more than it goes out west. Pennsylvania and Virginia's charter both operate like Connecticut's and goes due west all the way across the country. And Virginia's charter has an even bigger wrinkle. When it hits the Ohio River, it goes up almost at a 45-degree angle. So the original charter from the English king for Virginia basically gives them about half of Canada and a third of the United States.
Nice piece of land, huh?
Very nice piece of land. So now there are three states, as mentioned, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, which feel that their charter entitles them to land in what is referred to, excuse me, as the Ohio country. The Ohio country is mostly the state of Ohio, part of Western Pennsylvania, and parts of some of the, Indiana and West Virginia, but it's primarily the state of Ohio. And all three of them decide that's our opportunity for expansion. The problem, of course, is that there are Indian tribes in the way, most notably in Pennsylvania, the Delaware, but also other tribes, the Miamis, the Shawnees, the Wyandots, which were the Hurons. There's a whole series of tribes that are in this land, occupying it. And to complicate it even further, the Iroquois say, by the way, we own that land because we conquered the tribes that had been there, and by European right of conquest. So again, the Iroquois were so much smarter than anyone gave them credit for. They recognized that the Europeans would approve of that method, right of discovery, right of conquest, right of occupation. So they said, we conquered those tribes. That's our land. That becomes important because the English say, by treaty, the Iroquois are our vassals, and the French have admitted to that in one of the various European treaties that have been written. So when the Iroquois say, we own the Ohio country, the English say, by default, we own it also. The French say, no, 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 we discovered the Ohio country. People might remember the different explorers like de La Salle, who went through there and said, that's ours. So now you have the French and the English saying, we both own the same territory. You have the local tribe saying, we actually occupy it, we own it. We have the Iroquois saying, no, no, we're in charge of them. And we have three English colonies saying, by the way, within that English claim, we own that claim.
What could go wrong?
Not a thing. So it is, as they say, a tale as old as time. It's a real estate squabble.
Hmm.
And that's oversimplifying everything. But at the core of it, it's certainly a grand political struggle between the French and the English. It is a struggle between colonists and Native Americans, but it's a real estate squabble at its very core. The Virginians decide the best way to get this land is to start a colony. And they get a grant from the king that says, if you plant 50 families on the forks of the Ohio, which is very close to where Pittsburgh would be today, by this date in 1755, you will get 200,000 acres and a bonus 100,000 acres if you actually have a fort built. So the Virginia lieutenant governor sends a young Colonel Washington in 1752, 1753 to start exploring the area. He comes back, says the French have told him to leave. His mission has gone badly. The lieutenant governor sends him back with 300 men, what they called a half regiment. The regiment was supposed to be 600 men of Virginia militia. And they say, well, go build the fort. So he attempts to build a fort. He ends up calling it Fort Necessity. Some people may have heard that name in history. And there he is in 1754 in Fort Necessity, surrounded by French and Native American allies of the French. He's led there by a Iroquois chief who says, we should try and gain this land. The Iroquois are actually probably, there's no written documentation, but they're probably trying to start a war between the French and the English. Washington is sitting in this indefensible position in the middle of a field. The Native American chief, Tanacharison, points out to him, by the way, the French can shoot down into the position because you've left them all the high ground. And you can't dig trenches, which they attempt to do because the water table is so high that they can only dig down to about 3 feet before they hit a significant amount of water. So here they are trying to occupy a fort and some trenches around the fort. The guys are knee-deep to waist-deep in water. The weather's ugly, and there are people shooting down on them. It doesn't last long. Washington surrenders, is given something that's called honors of war, which means he's allowed to march out with his little flag and his little cannon, and everybody keeps their arms. That, in essence, infuriates the English, who say, well, we can't have this. When he gets back to Virginia, the governor sends a note to the king. The king sends General Braddock with 2 regiments of troops. It's now 1755, and this starts the real war with the Battle of Monongahela in 1755. So officially, there's no war yet because it hasn't been declared, but you could make the case that it really started in 1754 with that first skirmish between Washington and the French and their Native American allies. It's hard, as most people, look at something like Korea, which was never a declared war. It's hard to say when you've been in battle and there's a real pitched battle, which there was in the Battle of Monongahela, that, oh, we're not actually at war. That's just a skirmish.
Yeah, skirmish and all those people lying dead. It's not such a skirmish, is it?
Absolutely. So that's the beginning of the war. The war goes very badly for the English, which I have a lot of English friends, particularly in the military history community, and they usually say with a chuckle, well, we usually lose at the beginning, but we always win at the end. So their mindset is we're never really prepared, but we get there. And this war certainly proves that because they lose every battle from 1755 to 1758, pretty much.
Yeah, one of the things that I have read, obviously, is that the British were used to European military tactics. I mean, they had these red coats. They were marching in formation out in the open. That's what they were used to doing. And the Native Americans and the French, for that matter, as well, were more guerrilla type tactics, which really seemed to be a lot more successful, at least in the beginning part of the war. The French were, leveraging those skills plus the Native American allies that they had against the British. So did the British really, when they turned the tide, is it because they changed their military tactics, or did they really overwhelm them with numbers, or was it a combination of both?
It's really a combination of those two things, plus a lot of bribes from the British to Native American tribes to get them to switch sides. So if you recall that the Delaware were the primary tribe being pushed out of Pennsylvania by the colonists, and General Braddock was asked by the Delaware when he was seeking support against the French, what happens when you kick the French out? Will we get our land back? And Braddock said, no, this goes to us, which was a really disastrous statement. So they all said, well, we're not actually going to help you now. In fact, we'll go fight with the French. So English arrogance really hurt them in the beginning of the war. Their methodology of fighting, and they had a small army. They had one of the smaller armies, but it was a very effective army in military standards in Europe against the French or the Prussians or the Austrians. So it tended to be very successful, and they would not change their ways. So yes, they wore red coats, and the Native Americans were thrilled to fight them. They had not seen them before 1755. There were no, people don't realize this, there were no British troops in the American colonies until 1755. So you go from the first colony in 1607, you go almost 150 years with no British troops.
Mm.
So when they show up, they're welcomed by the colonists, and they make a pretty sight. They have marching band and fife and drums and beautiful flags, and they march off in crisp lines. But when they end up in the wilderness, they can't march four abreast. They tend to be two abreast at best in many of these places. Sometimes they have to go single file, depending on how bad the trail is. They are wearing a color which will not be missed. And then to top it all off, they have white bandoliers coming across their chest in an X pattern.
Oh, bullseye.
So they have a bullseye. So the Native Americans learned very quickly that all we have to do is aim for the center of the X, one shot, drops the person, they're out, period. And that's what happens in Battle of Monongahela. The Native Americans fight behind rocks and trees. The British line up. They generally were in three deep lines, and they would have a very regimented fire discipline, which is why they were so good in European context. And their goal was to fire 3 rounds a minute. If you've ever seen a musket demonstration or picked up a musket, been to a historical reenactment or any of the American forts, muskets are on the heavier side. It is a complicated process. It's as many as 12 steps, depending on the approach that military uses to actually load and fire a musket. So to get 3 shots off in 1 minute means that you are not focusing. You're just on anything other than the process of putting the bullet in, ramming it down, et cetera, et cetera. So consequently, the English line up in the Battle of Monongahela and shoot into their own ranks because they're not looking at who's in front of them. They're just following the orders. And their officer says, ready, aim, fire, and they do. So a significant number of English troops that day were shot in the back.
Oh,
It was total chaos. There was smoke, there was screaming, there was yelling, there was obviously an enormous amount of blood. There were wounded individuals crying out. It was an unmitigated disaster for them. And the French and Indian allies, Native American allies, couldn't believe how easy this was. It took them about 2 hours to basically decimate the English force. And that continued on for the next several years.
Several years. Now, in your book, French and Indian Wars, you get into some great detail, but indeed the tide did turn. You mentioned about bribery, because it doesn't seem like there was much in it for the Native American tribes if they helped the British, because you think about the British were there to colonize and perhaps, and definitely push the Native American tribes out. What was really the incentive for those tribes to join up with the British?
Well, the primary tribe that they were able to sway was the Delaware themselves. So in 1758, they finally agree at a treaty in eastern Pennsylvania that they will give the Delaware back all the land basically from the center of Pennsylvania to the west of Pennsylvania. So that plus various goods. Bribery in those terms, by the way, is all physical goods, not cash. The Indians had no interest in any English money. I mean, they knew about it and they could use it themselves to buy things, but primarily they wanted goods. They wanted trade goods. They wanted more muskets. They wanted powder, etc. They couldn't make powder themselves, and they could make lead balls. It wasn't easy, but they couldn't make gunpowder. So that was one of the primary things they wanted. So English was giving them all of that. But the primary thing they finally agreed to in 1758, 3 years after they had said you can't have your own land back. In fact, any more we take, we're keeping. They say you can have it back. So the Delawares say, right, if we're going to get our land back, let's stop, let's quit. And they do. So the English are able to take Fort Duquesne, which is what they were gone for in 1755. They're able to take it because the Delaware no longer, and the Shawnee, who were allied with the Delaware, no longer support the French. And that's a big shift in the West. The English did change some of their methodology. So they stopped fighting in 3 lines. They switched to 2 lines. They also had a rule where you were not allowed to take cover. You had to stand there and fire. They changed that rule. They allowed their troops to hide behind a tree or a rock, just like the French Canadians did, or just like the Native Americans did. So they got better at wilderness warfare. They were never good at it. And we're talking about the English soldiers. We should not leave out the colonial militia, who were even worse. Other than Massachusetts, which had a very effective militia, the militia for the other colonies were either virtually non-existent or terrible. So if you look at the manpower, even though there were English troops, the significant percentage of total forces in the field for the English side was still colonial militia. They just weren't very good. Again, with the one notable exception of the Massachusetts militia. Connecticut and Rhode Island often didn't send much in the way of militia because the Massachusetts folks took the brunt of the fighting. New York actually didn't want to be in the war. New York was very interested in trading with the French. In fact, traded with the French throughout the war, even though that was a treasonous action. Pennsylvania were Quakers, so they literally had no militia. By statute in Pennsylvania, they finally had to get the Brethren, Quakers in England, to convince their local co-religionists to not vote. So there was a vote finally in 1757 or 8 for establishing a Pennsylvania militia, and the Quakers didn't vote, so it passed on because of that. So you're looking at Virginia militia was totally ineffective. They wouldn't leave their hometown. So there really was no great effort except in the northern frontier, where the Massachusetts militia were good, and the British then concentrated in 1757 onward with their troops. And that was one of the big changes. And of course, the British just had so much money and they had naval control. They were eventually able to blockade the French. French couldn't get more trade goods to give their Indian allies. So it was a whole series of things that eventually the attrition of it, more economic probably than military, is what enabled the English to win.
Yes, and I encourage people to read your book and really I think, focusing in on the Native American contributions to that war, and you talk about the political astuteness and the strategies and sort of the infighting between the different tribes for control of land. It's just a super fascinating story. Now, tell me, the master's thesis that you did, is that really what turned into this book, or did the book require more work, more research, and things like that?
It started out with the master's thesis. About half the book is the master's thesis, edited, of course, to fit the way the story needed to evolve in book form. And the other half is more original research. One of the amusing things from a research perspective is, the Library of Congress has no information on this period because we're not a country yet. So their records really start at the Revolution. The real information is in the state historical societies, which are typically in the state capitals, in Boston and Hartford and things like that. So New York City, though, in the case of New York State. So there is a wealth of information that is available from early 1600s all the way through mid 1700s, because the English settlers were able to read and write for the most part. So we have an enormous amount of first-person source material, journals in particular, some memoirs, but you have journals from the day, and I quote extensively in some cases from journals of various individuals. Some of them are private, so corporals in the Army. Some of them are captains and majors. So it was the literacy of the colonists was fairly high, not universal, but fairly high. The French sources are almost exclusively officers, although there are a few non-officers who've written some very interesting memoirs. The problem is the Native American
Sure.
information. They don't use a written language. So what we have is some very interesting and useful translated information in primarily treaty talks. That's where you get a lot of the information. And then from the French memoirs, because the French officers who were present at these battles will often talk about what the Native Americans were saying in terms of strategy or tactics in an upcoming situation, but we don't get it directly from them. And that creates biases, right? You have the translation bias because some of these languages are quite complicated. You have reasons why people might want particularly the English treaties where they're trying to negotiate land away from various tribes. They're very happy to write things that will be in the historical record, which says, oh, and they agreed to do this. And they didn't necessarily agree. There was a lot of land swindling going on, long American tradition of
Yeah,
doing
I think so.
continued, well into the West, et cetera.
Yeah,
But
how did that the deal with the Delaware Indians for Pennsylvania land work out for them
it
ultimately?
didn't. Of
Not
course,
good,
when the
right?
war ended, the colonists immediately said, "Get out." And when they wouldn't get out, they started attacking them. So
Yeah.
they got nothing out of it. One of the interesting things that's in my novel that I found is the way you could tell if a treaty was real or not with a Native American tribal group is whether it was signed with a name or not. So the English colonists, when they would forge them, would sign Chief so-and-so. Well, of course, they didn't write that. They usually put a symbol. So they had various names generally related to creatures or spirits or things like that. So, someone might be, famous ones like, White Cloud and Red Cloud and things like that. So they would draw the symbol of what their name was. So if you saw that the name was written out, it was a forgery. And if you saw a drawing of what would have been their name, it was most likely, not always, but most likely real.
That is really interesting. I did not know that. When I think back of when I studied history in school and say high school or whatever, when the French and Indian War was something that we briefly studied just to understand that the British incurred a lot of expenses from that war and they had to pass them on to the colonists, and the colonists didn't like that without representation, and the American Revolution takes place. But we almost skipped from like the explorers quickly over the French and Indian War to the American Revolution. So
Right.
it's so refreshing to get this in-depth look. So thank you for doing that. But we're going to talk about your novel. It's called Métis. It's Metis, and it's the life and times of Charles de Langlade. Is that how you say it?
It's close enough. Um,
I'm going to get it wrong every time. I know I'm going to
So
a different way,
I
but
pronounce it multiple ways depending on what day it is myself. So
yeah, tell us what gave you the inspiration to write this novel and who was this main character you're speaking of?
Charles is one of the leading French Canadian officers, and because his background is biracial, his mother is the daughter of an Ottawa chieftain, and his father is a fur merchant. And they were based in the Midwest. So he actually is born at what was called Michilimackinac, which is now Mackinac. He was born there, and then the family relocated to Green Bay. So he is incredibly well connected, both by physical location and by family ties to a variety of tribes in the upper Midwest. Because of that, and he's also an officer in the French Marines, he gets significant commands of Native American contingents. So he leads the Native American forces at the Battle of Monongahela. The French leader is killed in the first volley, so he's actually in charge of the whole French and Native American side in that battle. He ends up walking and canoeing thousands of miles every year to go to war. He goes home in the winter, he comes back in the spring, like most people did, except he is covering a ridiculous amount of terrain. No roads, and almost never on horseback either. So it's really just incredible that he's there. He's at the Battle of Fort William Henry, which is the last of the Mohicans. He's at the Battle of Quebec at the end of the war. And he's everywhere in between. So I tell people he was the Forrest Gump of the time period. And
He was. But you set this up. Now, this is a historical fiction, so
correct.
he's a real character. He did a lot of the things that are in here, but you had to sort of create this situation where he's being interviewed by a reporter.
Right. So I thought he was an interesting character. There is one book that was written in the 1800s about him. It's not very well written. And the print copy is bad. And, from a lot of things from that time period, it's not going into reprint, as you can imagine. So we're looking at a very thin description of his life, and there's really very little. He's mentioned in a number of the other memoirs by various military leaders, but there's not a lot of information, and some of it is conflicting on his life. So how do I get there? So what I decided as the entry point was to use a reporter. So I created a reporter by the name of P.V. Lawson. Now, P.V. Lawson is actually the person who wrote the biography of Langlade. So I cheat. I move him forward about 75 years to 1801. And I have him come out from New York. So I have the New York Evening Post, which was started by Alexander Hamilton, true. I have the original editor who was there, and he's Langlade's editor. And he goes out to interview Langlade because he wants a full-time job. He's what is referred to as a stringer, which one of the fun things in doing the research is, you get into the etymology. Did this word even exist back then? And it does. Stringer comes from someone who strings together words for an article. So he's basically, we have now 1099 employees, ad hoc, consultants, and temps, different terms, but that's what he was. And he goes out there with the goal of doing such a good job that when he comes back, he will get a full-time job for the New York Evening Post. He arrives. There's some background about him coming out there, et cetera, but he arrives in Green Bay to try and interview Langlade, who is hungover and half asleep at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He's thinking, boy, this is going badly to start. And the two of them don't get along in the beginning, and they grudgingly come to like each other over a period of chapters and days of interaction and a lot of rum.
Yeah, a lot of
So,
rum.
um,
Well-oiled interview.
yes. But it was a fun, way to do it. It also enabled me to give some backstory about his time in New York. I sprinkle in the book various meals that they have and provide recipes for scrapple and for fricassees and things like that. A rabbit stew in multiple different ways. And then drinks, fun colonial and mid 18th century drinks. My favorite of which was called Rattle Skull, because it was a favorite of the English, and it was basically whiskey with some porter poured into it. And it was called that because by the end of it, people were just babbling. So they
I
would
think
rattle
so.
their skull.
I'm going to stay away from that one, I think. But
Probably pass on it.
what I really like about it is that you're bringing to life a character who lived such an interesting life and in such an interesting period of time, dating back to the middle of the 18th century, right up to the point where the United States exists. And he sort of switches sides throughout his life.
Multiple times.
He's with the French, he's with the British, he's with the Americans ultimately, and it's a terrific story, and it is a challenge. I would imagine a big challenge to be true to the history, but also make it flow and make it fun and very readable. And I think using a reporter is a great idea because you can ask the questions that you think the readers would want to know about this person. So one thing about that book is the Métis. I had never heard of the Métis, and I didn't realize it was such a significant group of peoples that it was they were mixed race. They were both Native American and French, and there was a fairly significant number of people of these Métis. And that's something that was new to me. And I appreciate you bringing that out. And I encourage people to read that novel. I want to ask you, what are you working on now, Michael?
Well, I've got a couple of projects in mind, but I'm not really started on them yet. One project that I've been doing a little bit of background on is taking the P.V. Lawson character and having him go on the Lewis and Clark expedition,
Oh, I like
which,
that.
which starts in 1803. So this book is ending in 1801. He's working for the newspaper. He comes back and they say, well, what are we going to do with you now? Let's send him off to do this. So that's in terms of a literary sense, that's probably the most likely next project. The other project that I've been working on, but it won't start till next year, is sort of a travelogue of racetracks and horse racing events around the globe. So my father and family were very big into thoroughbred horse racing and got me involved, and so I've always had an interest in this. And it's a little bit of an homage to my father and the time he spent in England and in Canada and the US on racetracks. But I'll add in Dubai and Australia and Hong Kong, so to really make it truly global.
Oh, that is terrific. So all that time in the library as a kid paid off. Tell us, what would you say to somebody who is maybe thinking about retiring soon? Maybe they don't have a lot of hobbies, or maybe they do have hobbies, but they're really interested in history and doing something different with their retirement time. And they may be looking at it like that's overwhelming. It's too much work. I don't want to, I can't invest that much time. I got other things I want to do, but I'd really like to do it. What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I mean, the short answer is I would just start. I would encourage anybody who's interested in history or the related fields, geography, sociology, archaeology, anthropology. These are all connected fields in many ways. And in fact, there's no history without getting into those topics, including economics and military issues, et cetera, so political issues. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and it's very satisfying to find out things, to do the research. I would say, I went to a great high school, I went to a great university, but this master's degree was far and away the most work I'd ever done on any single thing. The depth of research required, the time commitment, the mental energy, the frustration at points in time, of course, and the output dwarfs everything else I ever did academically, and really dwarfs most anything I did in a business sense because business tends to be so much more transactional. This is something that was a significant commitment. It did not finish in a year, COVID hit, et cetera. But so it really took me 2 years to finish writing the first book. The second book, the novel, only took me about 6 months. So because almost all the research was done ahead of time. But it was just a great feeling of accomplishment. So I would encourage anybody to pursue things like this. It is not, you're not going to have a bestseller. I mean, occasionally someone might. I don't mean to disparage every effort, but you're doing it for yourself. You're doing it for your family. You're doing it for the interest. You're doing it sometimes to add to the historical record. My novel is bought mostly by friends and family. The history has been bought by people all over the globe. And as someone said to me, this will be, my professor said, this will be bought for the next 20 years. Anybody writing on the French and Indian War is going to go find your book. And they're going to utilize it, and they're going to quote it. So there's a little piece of me that is sort of like a time capsule. A little piece of me is shot out into the future. I haven't gotten Elon Musk to put it on anything going to Mars yet, but yeah.
Well, terrific work. And really, because the French and Indian War is something that a lot of people don't know a lot about. Same with the War of 1812. I'm
Right.
going to look out there for a War of 1812 author to interview next. Although I think one of the best accounts of the War of 1812 was written by Teddy Roosevelt. So he's not around to interview, but I just think it's wonderful that you've done all this work, all this research, that you went to England and did a lot of your studies, but I think you also visited some of these places where these events took place?
Sure,
So
sure.
yeah, you immersed yourself in it. Wonderful books, and we're going to put both books in our show notes so people can find them and order them. Are there other ways that people can find out more about you and these books?
Well, they're available on Amazon. It's easy. You can punch in my name, or you can punch in, either title. Métis: The Life and Time of Charles de Langlade will get you there. The other title's a little longer-winded: French and Indian War, 1609 to 1759, conflicts that shaped the continent. So I think the other thing that I tried to point out in the history book is all the impact of these wars on the future of America. The Constitution has several clauses in it that are directly related to this war. As you pointed out, the revolution starts because people are upset about taxes. Well, the other thing they were upset about was the Royal Proclamation in 1763 saying you can't go west of the Alleghenies because we're trying to stop you fighting with the Indians. And of course, the colonists don't pay any attention to that. The fact that the British lost almost every battle in the first 3 years of the war, the colonists saw that. So, the training of all the officer corps, George Washington learns how to fight because of this war, as do almost all the generals that end up in the war on the colonial side. So much of this time period creates the United States. The Constitution itself, its leadership, its form of the states, our relations with Native Americans, our relations with Europe. The War of 1812 is a direct result of the Revolution. The English are itching to get back at us. And there's an awful lot that comes out of this that we don't get taught in school.
Well, thank you for this work, because a lot of people are going to benefit from it, including myself. And thanks for taking the time out to speak with Your History, Your Story. Michael, looking forward to that book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Please let me know when that comes out, because we'll talk again, okay?
Terrific. I will. Thank you, James. I appreciate the opportunity today.
Oh, absolutely, Michael. And have a great day, okay?
And you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.